Hey, stop scrolling for a second, because what I'm about to tell you actually happened to someone I know, and even now, thinking about it gives me chills. Picture this. A woman on her knees, folding her clothes into an old suitcase, tears falling onto the fabric she's packing. She's not stealing anything. She's not running from trouble. She's leaving the only job that ever gave her hope. And the man standing over her, the one who could fire her with one phone call, is about to hear 4 words that will change the rest of his life. Nobody saw this coming. Not him. Not her. Not even me, and I've heard this story 100 times. Stay with me, because this one gets unbelievable. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments, I really do read every single one. Today's story is about pride, about silence, about a secret that almost cost 2 people everything they never knew they wanted. It's heartwarming, it's heartbreaking, and by the end, I promise you, it will make you believe in second chances again. Let's begin. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days. Daniel Whitfield stood at the window of his penthouse office on the 52nd floor, watching Manhattan blur into gray streaks of light and water. He was 34 years old, and by every measure the world used to define success, he had already won. He owned 3 companies. His name was on the cover of magazines he'd never bothered to read. He had a mansion in Connecticut with more rooms than memories, and a fiancée, Vanessa Cole, who looked stunning on his arm at every gala, every charity dinner, every photograph that made strangers whisper, "Look how lucky he is." But lucky wasn't a word Daniel used for himself. Not anymore. He hadn't planned on coming home early that Thursday. The board meeting had ended ahead of schedule, and instead of heading to another dinner he didn't want to attend, he told his driver to take him to the house in Connecticut. He wanted quiet. He wanted, for one evening, to sit in his own living room without a stranger asking him for something. He didn't expect to find Maria Alvarez on her knees in the guest bedroom, tears streaming down her face, folding her uniform into a small, battered suitcase. Maria had worked for the Whitfield household for 2 years. She was 28, quiet in the way that made people underestimate her, and precise in everything she did. The way she pressed his shirts, the way she remembered that he liked his coffee black in the morning but with cream if he'd had a bad day, the way she never once complained, not when Vanessa snapped at her over a wrinkled napkin, not when the hours ran long, not when the isolation of that enormous house pressed in on her like a weight she carried alone. Daniel had noticed her. In the quiet way a busy man notices things he doesn't let himself think about. The way she hummed old songs in Spanish while she worked, songs he didn't understand but somehow felt. The way she left small, thoughtful things around the house. A bookmark in his unfinished novel, moved to the exact page he'd left off, though he'd never told her where he stopped reading. The way she looked at him sometimes, quickly, like she was catching herself doing something she shouldn't. He told himself it meant nothing. He was engaged. She was his employee. There were lines, and he respected lines, even when some quiet part of him wondered what was on the other side of them. Now she was on the floor of the guest room, packing. "Maria!" She startled so hard she dropped the shirt in her hands. When she looked up at him, her eyes were red and swollen, and something in his chest twisted painfully, the way it did when he saw something break that he didn't know how to fix. "Mr. Whitfield. I didn't hear the car. Why are you packing?" She looked away, back down at the suitcase, and folded the shirt again, though it was already folded. Her hands were shaking. "I have to go," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. I didn't know how." "Go where?" "Maria, talk to me. It's not your problem." "You've worked in my house for 2 years," he said, kneeling down across from her, ignoring the $4,000 suit that would surely wrinkle against the floor. "That makes it my problem." She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It cracked in the middle like something breaking further. "You don't understand. You've never had to understand." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, But that's when he heard the click of heels on hardwood behind him. Vanessa stood in the doorway of the guest room, one hand resting on the frame, watching the two of them with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. She was dressed for the evening gala they were supposed to attend together, a black gown that fit her the way expensive things always fit her, perfectly, deliberately like armor. "Well," Vanessa said softly, a small smile curling at the edge of her mouth. "Isn't this cozy?" Maria flinched like she'd been struck. She reached for the suitcase, trying to zip it closed with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "Vanessa, this isn't what it looks like," Daniel said, standing. "It never is," Vanessa replied, her voice light, almost amused, though something colder moved underneath it. "Maria, dear, finish packing. I think it's for the best, don't you?" "Vanessa." Daniel's voice sharpened. "I didn't ask her to leave." "No," Vanessa said, stepping into the room now, her eyes flicking toward Maria with something Daniel had never seen from her before. Not toward the staff, not toward anyone. "But I did." The room went silent except for the rain against the windows. Daniel turned slowly toward his fiancée. "You told her to leave. Without telling me." "Daniel, sweetheart," Vanessa said, her tone shifting to something practiced, something meant to soothe. "There are things happening in this house that you don't see because you're never here. I'm protecting us. I'm protecting our future." "What things?" Vanessa's eyes moved to Maria, who had gone very still, staring at the floor like she wished it would open and swallow her whole. "Ask her," Vanessa said. "Ask her why she's really leaving. And Daniel," she paused at the doorway, looking back at him with something that almost looked like pity. "When she tells you, I think you'll understand why I did what I did." She turned and disappeared down the hallway, her heels echoing against the marble like a countdown. Daniel turned back to Maria. She was crying harder now, silently, the kind of crying that came from somewhere deep and old, somewhere that had nothing to do with tonight at all. "Maria." He knelt back down in front of her. "What is she talking about? What aren't you telling me?" Maria looked up at him, her dark eyes swimming with tears, her hands still gripping the shirt she'd folded 3 times now. "Mr. Whitfield," she whispered. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago. Something about why I really came to work in this house. It's not what you think. None of it is what you think." Outside, thunder rolled low across the sky, and somewhere in that enormous, beautiful house, a truth that had been buried for 2 years was about to come rising to the surface. A truth that would end an engagement, expose a lie, and reveal a debt of love so old, so quiet, that Daniel Whitfield would spend the rest of his life grateful it finally found him. But that story, the real story, was only just beginning. 2 years earlier, Maria hadn't set out to become anyone's maid. She had come to New York from a small town outside Phoenix carrying one suitcase, $400, and a folder of medical papers she couldn't afford to think about too closely. Her mother, Rosa, had raised her alone after her father passed when Maria was 11. 2 jobs, sometimes 3, cleaning houses in wealthy neighborhoods while Maria did her homework in the back seat of their rusted-out Honda. Rosa had sacrificed everything so that Maria could go to community college, then transfer to a state university. Then, against every odds stacked against a girl from their zip code, graduate with a degree in early childhood education. Then Rosa got sick. The diagnosis came fast and cruel. A rare autoimmune disorder that attacked her kidneys, one that required treatment their insurance barely covered and medication that cost more than Maria's monthly rent. Maria took a job as a substitute teacher, then picked up weekend work cleaning houses, the same work her mother had done for decades, because it paid in cash and it paid immediately. And immediately was the only speed that mattered anymore. That's how she ended up, on a cold October morning, standing outside a staffing agency that placed domestic workers in the homes of Manhattan's wealthiest families. The agency owner, a brisk woman named Denise, looked over Maria's resume. A bachelor's degree, 3 years of teaching experience, with visible confusion. "You're overqualified for this," Denise said. "I need the money faster than teaching pays," Maria answered honestly. "My mother is sick. I'll take anything." Denise studied her for a long moment, then slid a folder across the desk. The Whitfield estate in Connecticut. Big house, big money, and I'll be honest with you, the client is difficult. His last 3 housekeepers didn't last 6 months. But it pays well, and it comes with housing, which means you'd save on rent. Maria didn't hesitate. I'll take it. She met Daniel Whitfield for the first time on a Tuesday morning in November. He was not what she expected. She had imagined someone cold, dismissive, the kind of man who wouldn't remember her name by the end of the week. Instead, he'd shaken her hand, actually shaken it like she was someone, not something, and said, "Thank you for being here. I know this house is a lot to manage alone." It was a small kindness. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. But Maria had spent 3 years being invisible in other people's homes, and being seen, even in that small way, cracked something open in her that she'd forgotten was there. Over the following months, Maria built a quiet rhythm in the Whitfield house. She learned Daniel's habits the way she'd once learned her students, the way he paced when he was stressed on a phone call, the way he skipped breakfast when he had bad news to deliver, the way his shoulders dropped half an inch when he came home to an empty house that never felt like it belonged to him. She never meant to fall for him. She would tell herself that later, over and over, like a prayer. It happened slowly, the way things that matter usually do. Not in one dramatic moment, but in 100 small ones. The morning he found her crying in the pantry after a call from her mother's doctor, and instead of walking past, he sat down on the cold floor beside her and asked what was wrong, and listened, really listened, for 40 minutes while his coffee went cold on the counter. The evening he noticed she'd stayed 2 hours late finishing a project and told her to go home, then quietly adjusted her pay without being asked. The rainy afternoon he caught her humming an old song in Spanish and asked what it meant, and she told him it was a lullaby her mother used to sing, and he said, "It's beautiful. Would you teach me the words sometime?" And meant it. He never crossed the line. He was engaged to Vanessa, a woman as polished and untouchable as the marble floors of his house, and Maria respected that, even when some nights the respect cost her more than she wanted to admit. She kept her feelings folded away like the shirts in his closet, precise, hidden, out of sight. But her mother's medical bills kept climbing. 6 months ago, Rose's condition worsened. A required surgery, one not fully covered by insurance, a number so large it made Maria's stomach turn every time she looked at it. She'd taken out a loan she couldn't really afford, then a second one quietly, without telling anyone at the Whitfield house, because pride mattered to her, because she refused to be pitted, because she'd promised herself long ago that she would never let anyone see her drowning. But 3 weeks ago everything came apart. Vanessa found the letters. Collection notices, addressed to Maria, that had accidentally been delivered to the main house instead of the staff quarters. Vanessa read them, all of them, sitting in the kitchen with a glass of wine, waiting for Maria to come find them missing. "You're in debt," Vanessa had said, when Maria finally worked up the courage to ask if she'd seen the mail. "Deeply in debt. Does Daniel know?" "No," Maria had answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'd like to keep it that way." Vanessa had smiled then, the kind of smile that looked friendly on the surface and cut like glass underneath. "Interesting. Because I've also noticed the way you look at him, Maria. The way you remember his coffee order. The way you laugh at his jokes when no one else in this house even hears them. Should I be worried?" "No," Maria had said too quickly, panic rising in her throat. "Never. I would never." "I believe you," Vanessa had said, though her eyes said something else entirely. "But here's what's going to happen. You're going to finish out this month quietly, and then you're going to find a reason to leave. Family emergency. A better opportunity. Anything. And you're not going to tell Daniel about the debt. And you're not going to tell him why you're really leaving. Because if you do, I'll make sure every agency in this city knows you're the housekeeper who fell in love with her employer and lied about a financial mess big enough to swallow her whole. Do you understand me?" Maria had understood perfectly. And so, for 3 weeks, she'd smiled through her work. hidden her tears in the pantry when no one was looking, and quietly begun packing her life back into the same suitcase she'd arrived with. Until tonight, when Daniel came home 3 hours early, and found her on the floor of the guest room, and asked the question she'd been dreading for 3 weeks straight. "What aren't you telling me?" Maria sat on the floor of the guest room, the folded shirt still clutched in her hands, and felt the weight of 2 years of silence pressing down on her chest like something physical. "Maria," Daniel said again, gently this time, kneeling closer. "Please. Whatever it is, just tell me." She looked up at him, and something in his face, the genuine worry, the total absence of judgment, broke the last thread holding her silence together. "I'm in debt," she said quietly. "A lot of debt. My mother has been sick for 2 years. Kidney disease. The treatments cost more than I make in 6 months, and the surgery she needed last spring cost more than I'll make in 3 years. Took out loans. Then more loans. I've been drowning for a long time, Mr. Whitfield, and I didn't want you to know because," her voice cracked, "because I didn't want you to see me as someone to pity. I wanted to earn my place here, not be given one out of charity." Daniel sat back on his heels, absorbing this. "That's not something to be ashamed of, Maria. That's something I could have helped with. Why didn't you come to me?" "Because Vanessa found out first." The name landed in the room like a dropped glass. "She found the collection letters 3 weeks ago," Maria continued, the words spilling out now, unstoppable, like a dam that had finally cracked. "She read them. And she told me if I didn't quietly find a reason to leave, without telling you the real reason, she would make sure I never worked in this city again. She said," Maria stopped, swallowing hard. "She said she'd noticed the way I look at you. And she said if I told you the truth about any of it, the debt or," she hesitated, "anything else, she'd destroy my reputation before I even had the chance to explain myself." The room went completely silent. Even the rain outside seemed to hold its breath. Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach, the particular coldness of realizing a person you trusted had been quietly poisoning the well beneath your feet for weeks while smiling at you across the dinner table. "She threatened you," he said slowly, "to protect a lie." "She thought she was protecting your relationship," Maria said, though even she didn't sound convinced by her own defense. "No," Daniel said, standing now, his voice hardening with something Maria had never heard from him before. Not anger at her, but a controlled, quiet fury aimed somewhere else entirely. "She wasn't protecting anything. She was controlling something. There's a difference." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small guest room once, twice, trying to fold 2 years of assumptions into a shape that suddenly made sense in a completely different way. "The way I look at you," he repeated softly, almost to himself. "Maria, is that true? The way you look at me?" Maria's face flushed deep red, and for a moment she considered lying, considered folding the truth back into the suitcase where she tried so hard to keep it hidden. But she was so tired of hiding, tired of folding herself smaller and smaller to fit into spaces that were never built for the whole truth of her. "Yes," she whispered. "It's true. I never meant for it to happen. I know my place in this house. I know what I am to you. An employee, nothing more, nothing you owe anything to. I would have carried it quietly for the rest of my life if I had to. I never wanted to be a problem for you." "You were never a problem," Daniel said, kneeling back down in front of her, close enough now that she could see the storm moving behind his eyes. Not anger, but something rawer, something that looked almost like relief. "Maria, do you have any idea what these 2 years have been like for me? Coming home to a house that never once felt warm until you started working in it. Vanessa and we've been engaged for 8 months, and in 8 months, she has never once asked me how my day was and actually waited to hear the answer. You did that every single evening. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I told myself I was imagining things. But I wasn't, was I?" Maria shook her head slowly, tears falling freely now. "No, you weren't." "Then why?" Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you the one who was about to walk out that door? Before Maria could answer, footsteps echoed sharply down the hallway, and Vanessa appeared in the doorway once more. Her earlier calm completely gone, replaced by something sharper, more desperate. "Daniel, we need to leave for the gala," she said, her voice tight. "Now." Daniel stood slowly, turning to face her, and for the first time in 8 months, Vanessa saw something in his expression that made her take an involuntary step backward. "You knew," he said quietly. "You knew about her mother. You knew about the debt. And instead of telling me so I could help, you threatened her into silence and tried to force her out of this house without a word of explanation. Daniel, I was protecting." "Don't," he said, his voice like ice now. "Don't tell me you were protecting our relationship. You were protecting your control over it. There's a difference, and I think you know that better than anyone." Vanessa's composure cracked for just a moment, something raw and frightened flashing across her face before the mask slid back into place. "She's the housekeeper, Daniel. I found her lying about her financial situation and clearly harboring feelings for my fiancé. And I handled it the way any reasonable person would. Reasonable people don't blackmail sick women who are drowning in medical debt," Daniel said. "Reasonable people don't threaten someone's entire livelihood to protect their own pride." Vanessa's eyes flicked to Maria, still sitting on the floor, tears streaming silently down her face, and something like genuine cruelty flashed across Vanessa's expression. "Fine," Vanessa said, her voice suddenly cold and clipped. "You want the truth, Daniel. I've known about your little crush on the help for months. I let it slide because I assumed you'd never actually do anything about it. You're too controlled, too image-conscious to throw away everything we've built for Maid with a sob story. But clearly I overestimated you. So go ahead. Choose her. Choose the woman who irons your shirts over the woman who stood beside you at every event that actually matters to your business, your reputation, your entire future. See how long that lasts once the money runs dry on her end and the fantasy wears off." The room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like it might crack the walls. Daniel looked at Vanessa for a long moment, and then, without raising his voice, without another ounce of the anger that had been building in his chest, he said 4 words that would end their engagement completely. "Vanessa, we're done." Vanessa stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, waiting for the apology that always came after their fights, the flowers, the reservations at the restaurant she loved, the quiet capitulation that had defined their entire relationship. But this time, Daniel simply held her gaze, steady and unmoving, and said nothing more. "You're throwing away everything," Vanessa finally said, her voice trembling now. "For her." "I'm not throwing anything away," Daniel said quietly. "I'm finally seeing clearly what I should have seen months ago. This relationship was never about partnership, Vanessa. It was about image. You liked the idea of me, the company, the house, the photographs. You never once asked what I actually wanted out of any of it. And she has." Vanessa's laugh was sharp, brittle. "She's known you for 2 years and she's cleaning your bathroom, Daniel. Don't be a fool. She's been the only honest thing in this house," Daniel said. "And that includes me, because I've spent months pretending I didn't notice how alone I felt every single day I came home to you." Vanessa's face went white, then red, fury and humiliation warring across her features. She looked at Maria one last time, still kneeling on the floor amid the half-packed suitcase, tears drying slowly on her cheeks. "You'll regret this," Vanessa said, though it was unclear now whether she was speaking to Daniel or to Maria or to herself. "Both of you." She turned and left, her heels striking the marble floor with a fury that echoed down the long hallway, out through the front door, and into the rain. Moments later, they heard her car engine roar to life, tires screeching against the wet driveway as she pulled away. The house fell silent. Daniel exhaled slowly, then turned back to Maria, who was staring at him with an expression somewhere between disbelief and fear. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Not because of me." "I didn't do it because of you," Daniel said, sitting back down on the floor across from her. The expensive suit forgotten entirely now. I did it because of me. Because I've been living a life that looked right on paper and felt empty every single day. And I think some part of me has known that for a long time. You just made it impossible to keep pretending. Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, looking down at the half-packed suitcase between them. I still have to leave though. The debt doesn't go away just because Vanessa is gone. My mother still needs care. I still need to find work that pays enough to cover it. Maria. Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. Let me help you. Not because I pity you, because I care about you and I have for a long time, and I was too much of a coward to admit it while I was engaged to someone else. Let me help your mother. Let me help you. Please. I can't just accept. You can, he said. Not as charity. As someone who cares about what happens to you and to Rosa, because from everything you've told me about her, she raised an incredible daughter, and I would like the chance to meet her if you'll let me. Maria stared at him for a long moment, something fragile and hopeful flickering behind the exhaustion in her eyes. You'd really do that? For someone you barely know? I know you better than I've known anyone in years, Daniel said quietly. I know you hum old songs when you think no one's listening. I know you cry in the pantry when your mother has a bad day. And you never let anyone see it because you don't want to be a burden. I know you remember how I'd take my coffee depending on my mood before I even know it myself. That's not barely knowing someone, Maria. That's knowing someone in the way that actually matters. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of fear or exhaustion. They were something else entirely, something that felt for the first time in years like relief. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say you'll stay, Daniel said. Not as my housekeeper. As someone I'd like the chance to know completely. With no lines between us, no titles, no pretending. Just you and me, figuring out whatever this is. Maria let out a small, disbelieving laugh through her tears. 2 hours ago I was packing to leave this house forever. Convinced I'd never see you again. And now, Maria said softly, reaching out to take his hand. I think I'd like to stay and find out what happens next. Outside, the rain finally began to slow, the storm that had raged for 3 days breaking apart into soft, scattered drops against the window, the kind of rain that comes right before the sun. The weeks that followed were not simple, because real life rarely is, no matter how much a fairy tale might want it to be. Word of the broken engagement spread through Daniel's social circles within days, carried by whispers at galas and gossip columns eager for a story about a billionaire and his housekeeper. Vanessa, wounded and furious, made sure of it, granting interviews, dropping cruel insinuations, painting Maria as a gold digger who had seduced her way into a fortune. Maria read the headlines once, felt the old shame rise in her chest, the familiar instinct to disappear, to fold herself small and apologize for existing in spaces she'd been told weren't meant for her. But Daniel refused to let her carry that shame alone. They don't know you, he told her one evening, sitting across from her in the kitchen where they now regularly shared dinner, something that had never happened before, not once in 2 years, despite the countless meals she'd prepared for a house that ate alone. They know a headline. Let them talk. I know who you are. That's the only thing that matters. He arranged for Rosa to see a specialist in New York, one of the best kidney doctors in the country, covering every cost without making Maria feel like she owed him anything in return. He sat with Maria in waiting rooms during her mother's appointments, held her hand during the anxious hours, learned to make the pozole recipe Rosa taught him over video calls from her small kitchen in Phoenix, badly at first, then a little better each time, laughing at his own mistakes in a way that made Maria's chest ache with a happiness she hadn't let herself feel in years. Rosa, for her part, was skeptical at first, a mother's protective instinct sharpened by years of watching her daughter sacrifice everything for others while receiving so little in return. He's a billionaire, Rosa said during their first video call, eyeing Daniel with open suspicion. Men like that get bored of things that don't sparkle anymore. What happens when he gets bored of you? Mrs. Alvarez, Daniel had said, leaning into the camera with an earnestness that made Maria's heart swell. "I've had money my whole life. Money has never once made me happy. Your daughter is the first genuinely happy thing that's happened to me in years. And I promise you, I have no intention of letting that go because it's inconvenient or difficult. I know actions matter more than words. So let me show you over time instead of just telling you." Rosa hadn't been fully convinced that day. But over the following months, as Daniel kept showing up, for doctor's appointments, for late-night phone calls when Rosa was scared, for the quiet, unglamorous work of actually caring for someone rather than simply saying he did, her skepticism slowly softened into something like trust. Meanwhile, Maria struggled with a different kind of adjustment, learning to exist in Daniel's world not as staff, but as someone worthy of a seat at the table, quite literally. The other executives at Daniel's company were polite to her face but cold behind it, unsure how to treat a woman who had, in their eyes, skipped several rungs of a ladder they'd spent their lives climbing. At a company dinner 3 months into their relationship, one of Daniel's board members made a comment just loud enough for her to hear. Something about the help getting ideas above her station, and Maria excused herself to the bathroom, locking the door, pressing her palms against her eyes to keep from crying in a dress that cost more than she used to make in a month. Daniel found her 20 minutes later, having noticed her absence, and excused himself from the table without hesitation. "I heard what he said," Daniel told her through the bathroom door. "I'm handling it. But Maria, I need you to know something, and I need you to actually believe it, not just hear it. You didn't skip any rungs. You built a life out of almost nothing, took care of your mother when the world gave you every reason to give up, and worked harder than anyone in that room has ever had to work in their entire life. If anyone in there doesn't understand that, that's a reflection of their limitations, not yours." When Maria finally opened the door, eyes red but steady, Daniel didn't try to rush her back to the table. Instead, he took her hand and led her out a side entrance, and they spent the rest of the evening eating street tacos on a park bench in the cold, laughing about nothing in particular, the kind of evening that mattered infinitely more than any gala ever could. It was in moments like these, small, unglamorous, deeply human, that Maria began to believe, truly believe, that what was happening between them wasn't a fantasy destined to collapse the moment reality reasserted itself. It was real. It was slow and complicated and occasionally painful, but it was real in a way that nothing in her life had felt for a very long time. But real love, the kind that survives headlines and skepticism and awkward company dinners, is rarely tested only once. And 6 months into their relationship, a phone call would arrive that would test everything they'd built. Not from Vanessa, not from the board, but from a place far closer to home, and far more painful than either of them had prepared for. The call came on a Sunday morning in early spring, while Maria and Daniel were making breakfast together in the Connecticut kitchen. A habit they'd built slowly over the past 6 months, the kind of small domestic ritual neither of them had ever really experienced before. It was Rosa's neighbor, a kind woman named Carmen who'd known Maria since she was a child. Her voice was shaking. "Mija, you need to come home. Your mother collapsed this morning. The ambulance already took her to the hospital." Maria's whole body went cold. The pan in her hand clattered to the stove, forgotten. Daniel was beside her in an instant, steadying her, taking the phone gently from her trembling hands to get the details Maria could no longer process through the roar of panic in her ears. Within 2 hours, they were on Daniel's private jet, flying to Phoenix, Maria staring silently out the window the entire flight. Her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white. Daniel didn't try to fill the silence with empty reassurances. He simply held her hand, present and steady, letting her know without words that she wasn't facing this alone. At the hospital, the news was worse than either of them had prepared for. Rosa's kidneys, already weakened by years of illness, had finally begun to fail completely. She needed a transplant and soon, or the outcome would be devastating. The specialist explained the process gently but honestly. The search for a compatible donor, the waiting list, the very real possibility that time might run out before a match was found. Maria sat in the hospital hallway after the doctor left, her face in her hands, the weight of everything crashing down at once. 2 years of quiet sacrifice, of hidden debt, of carrying her mother's illness like a secret she couldn't share. And now, at the moment she'd finally allowed herself to believe things might be getting better, the ground was falling away again. "I can't lose her," Maria whispered. "She's the only family I have left. She gave up everything for me and I can't do this without her." Daniel knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. "You're not going to lose her. And you're not doing this alone, not for one single second. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, we are going to find her a donor, and we are going to get through this together. I promise you that." What Maria didn't know, what Daniel hadn't told her yet, because he'd been quietly arranging it for the past hour while she sat with her mother, was that he had already contacted the top transplant specialists in the country, offering to fund an expedited donor search, along with a substantial contribution to the hospital's transplant program in exchange for prioritized testing and resources. Money, for all its emptiness in other areas of his life, could move mountains here. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt grateful for every dollar he'd ever earned. But there was something else too. Something Daniel hadn't fully processed yet, sitting in that hospital hallway with Maria's hands trembling in his. He'd undergone a routine physical 2 weeks earlier, part of the company's executive health program, and during that appointment, almost as an afterthought, he'd been blood-typed and tested as part of a broader donor registry initiative the hospital's foundation, one of the many charitable causes he funded, had been running. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was simply paperwork, one more form among hundreds he signed without reading closely. 2 days later, as the hospital ran urgent compatibility tests on a growing list of potential donors, a call came through that made Daniel's chest tighten with a mixture of disbelief and something that felt almost like fate. He was a match. Not a perfect match, the doctors explained carefully, but a viable one, close enough in blood type and tissue compatibility to be a genuine life-saving option for Rosa, assuming further testing confirmed the initial results. Daniel sat with this information for nearly a full day before telling Maria, turning it over in his mind, understanding fully what it meant. The surgery, the recovery, the risk, however small, to his own body, all offered without hesitation for a woman he'd known for less than a year, the mother of the woman he loved. When he finally told Maria, sitting together in the small hospital cafeteria over cold coffee neither of them was really drinking, she stared at him in stunned silence for a long moment before the tears came. "You would do that? For my mother?" "Maria," Daniel said softly, "I would do it for you. Because she raised you, and because losing her would break something in you that I don't think could ever fully heal, and because I refuse to sit back and watch that happen when there's anything I can do to stop it. This isn't a small thing, Daniel. This is surgery. This is real risk to your own body." "I know," he said simply. "And I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Further testing over the following week confirmed what the initial results suggested. Daniel was, against every statistical odd, a strong enough match to proceed. The surgery was scheduled for 2 weeks later, giving Rosa's body time to stabilize and Daniel time to prepare, both medically and, Maria suspected, emotionally, for what he was about to do for a family that had been strangers to him barely a year before. The night before the surgery, Rosa asked to speak with Daniel alone. Maria waited outside the hospital room, watching through the small window as her mother, frail but fierce, took Daniel's hand in both of hers. "I doubted you," Rosa said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought you were a man who collected pretty things and grew tired of them. I was wrong, and I have never been happier to be wrong about anything in my entire life." "Mrs. Alvarez." "Rosa," she corrected gently. "You're about to give me a piece of yourself, Mijo. I think that earns you the right to call me by my name." Daniel's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "Rosa, thank you for raising the woman I love. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure she knows how loved she is, the way you made sure of it for her entire childhood." Outside the door, Maria pressed her hand against the glass, tears streaming silently down her face, watching the two most important people in her life bound together by something far deeper than blood. The surgery went smoothly, though the hours felt endless to Maria, sitting in the waiting room with Rosa's neighbor Carmen, gripping a paper cup of hospital coffee she never drank, watching the clock hands move with agonizing slowness. When the surgeon finally emerged, exhausted but smiling, Maria's whole body sagged with relief at the words she'd been praying to hear. Both procedures were successful. Your mother's body has already begun accepting the new kidney. Mr. Whitfield is in recovery and stable. Barring any complications, we're expecting excellent outcomes for both of them. Maria broke down completely then, months of accumulated fear and exhaustion finally releasing all at once, Carmen wrapping her arms around her as she sobbed with a relief so profound it felt almost physical, a weight lifting off her chest that she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying for years. Recovery was slow for both Daniel and Rosa, but steady. Maria split her time between their two hospital rooms, exhausted but radiant with a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. Daniel, weak from the surgery but stubbornly cheerful, spent his recovery making Rosa laugh from her own hospital bed down the hall, sending funny messages back and forth through Maria like teenagers passing notes, building a bond between them that Maria watched with quiet, overwhelming gratitude. 3 weeks later, both were discharged, and Daniel insisted Rosa recover at the Connecticut house rather than return alone to her small apartment in Phoenix. Maria worried it would be too much, too fast, too different from the modest life her mother had always known. But Rosa settled into the guest room, the same guest room where, months earlier, Maria had once knelt packing a suitcase, convinced her time in that house was ending forever, with a kind of quiet contentment that surprised them both. "Funny," Rosa said one evening, sitting on the back porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft orange and pink. "How life works out sometimes. I spent 30 years cleaning other people's beautiful houses, wondering what it would feel like to actually belong in one. Now I'm sitting on this porch, and for the first time in my life, I don't feel like a guest." "You're not a guest, Mom," Maria said, sitting down beside her, resting her head on her mother's shoulder. "You're family." "He gave me a piece of himself," Rosa said quietly, watching the last light fade over the trees. "I don't think I can ever fully repay that." "He doesn't want repayment," Maria said. "He just wants you here. Both of us here. That's enough for him." Rosa reached over and took her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. "I always told you, Mija, that love isn't about grand gestures. It's about who shows up when things are hardest. He showed up. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man he really is, underneath all that money." As the months passed, the house that had once felt cold and empty to Daniel slowly filled with warmth in a way he'd never experienced before. Rosa's laughter in the kitchen, the smell of her cooking replacing the sterile silence that used to define every meal, Maria's presence no longer confined to the edges of the house but woven fully into its center. Daniel found himself coming home earlier not because he had to, but because for the first time in his adult life, home actually felt like somewhere he wanted to be. But one evening, nearly a year after that rainy Thursday when Daniel had first found Maria packing her suitcase, a new challenge arrived. Not from illness or debt or a jealous ex-fiancé, but from something quieter, more internal, and in its own way, more difficult to navigate than anything that had come before. Daniel's board of directors, uneasy about the public attention surrounding his relationship and its impact on the company's carefully curated image, called an emergency meeting to discuss what they termed reputational concerns. The boardroom was cold in the way that only rooms filled with old money and older egos can be. Polished mahogany, city views stretching out beneath tinted glass, men and women in tailored suits who had built careers on protecting appearances above almost everything else. Daniel sat at the head of the table, Maria's absence deliberately felt in every glance exchanged around the room, though she had never once attended these meetings, had never asked to be part of his business world in any capacity beyond the personal life they'd built together. Daniel, said Harold Grayson, the company's longest-serving board member, a man who had known Daniel's late father and never quite let go of the authority that relationship once afforded him. We've supported your personal choices for the past year, but I think it's time we address the elephant in the room directly. Your relationship with Ms. Alvarez has generated significant media attention. Not all of it favorable. Several key investors have expressed concern about the company's image. My relationship with Maria is not a business matter, Daniel said evenly. Respectfully, Harold continued, when the tabloids run headlines calling you the billionaire who fell for the maid, it becomes a business matter whether we like it or not. We're not suggesting you end the relationship. We're suggesting a more discreet approach going forward. Fewer public appearances together, a more controlled media narrative, perhaps even a formal statement distancing the company's brand from the personal relationship entirely. Daniel felt something harden in his chest, a familiar anger rising, though quieter and more controlled than it had been the night he'd ended things with Vanessa. Let me understand this correctly, Daniel said slowly. You're asking me to hide the woman I love, to essentially treat her as an embarrassment to be managed, because some of you are uncomfortable with the fact that she comes from a working-class background instead of the kind of family you'd prefer to see photographed beside me. Silence settled over the room, uncomfortable and heavy. That's not what we're saying, another board member offered weakly. It's exactly what you're saying, Daniel replied. And I want to be very clear about something. Maria Alvarez worked harder for everything she has than anyone in this room ever had to. She spent years sacrificing her own comfort, her own dreams, to care for a mother who raised her practically alone. She never once asked me for anything, not money, not status, not access to any of this. He gestured broadly at the room around them. And when her mother needed a kidney, I gave her one of mine, not because I felt obligated, but because that family showed me more genuine love and loyalty in 6 months than I experienced in years of moving through rooms exactly like this one. He stood, buttoning his jacket, his voice calm but absolutely unwavering. So here's what's going to happen. I'm not going to hide her. I'm not going to manage her out of public view like she's a liability instead of the best thing that's ever happened to me. If this company's investors can't handle the fact that their CEO fell in love with someone who wasn't born into money, then perhaps this isn't the right company for me to lead. And I'm happy to discuss an exit strategy that protects shareholder value while I explore other ventures where my personal life isn't treated as a corporate liability. The threat landed exactly as intended. Daniel Whitfield leaving would trigger a stock collapse far more damaging than any tabloid headline about his relationship ever could, and every person in that room knew it. Harold cleared his throat, recalculating quickly. Daniel, no one is suggesting. I think everyone in this room was suggesting exactly that, Daniel said, and I'd like it noted for the record that I won't be entertaining this conversation again. Maria isn't going anywhere. And neither am I. If the company's board can't get comfortable with that reality, I trust you'll let me know so we can discuss next steps like professionals. He left the boardroom without waiting for a response, the silence behind him louder than anything that could have been said. That evening, when Daniel told Maria about the meeting, she listened quietly, her expression unreadable until he finished. You didn't have to fight for me like that, she said softly. You could have just done what they asked. Kept things quieter. Protected the company. I could have, Daniel agreed, taking her hand. But Maria, I spent 34 years protecting everything except the things that actually mattered. Protecting my image, my reputation, my carefully curated life. I'm done doing that. You're not something I need to manage or hide. You're the reason I finally understand what any of this success was supposed to be for in the first place. Maria's eyes filled with tears, the same tears that had fallen that rainy Thursday nearly a year ago, but entirely different in nature now. Not tears of fear or shame, but tears of a love so full it sometimes felt too large to hold inside her chest. I love you, she whispered. I don't think I've said that plainly enough, often enough. I love you, Daniel Whitfield, more than I ever thought I'd allow myself to love anyone. I love you too, Daniel said, pulling her close. "And I have something I'd like to ask you if you'll let me." He reached into his jacket pocket, and Maria's breath caught as she realized what he was holding. The ring wasn't showy. Not the enormous, ostentatious diamond Vanessa had once worn, the kind designed to be photographed and admired from across a room. It was simple, elegant, a modest stone set in gold, the kind of ring that felt like it had been chosen with genuine thought rather than status in mind. "Maria," Daniel said, kneeling in the same living room where, a year earlier, he'd knelt beside her on the floor of a guest bedroom, listening to a truth that changed both their lives forever. "I've spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My money, my name, my influence. You never wanted any of that. You wanted honesty and kindness and someone who showed up when things were hard, and somehow, without even trying, you taught me how to be exactly that person. Not just for you but for myself, for the first time in longer than I can remember." Maria's hands trembled as she pressed them against her mouth, tears already falling freely. "I don't have a perfect story to offer you," Daniel continued. "I have a complicated life, a company that will probably always demand more of my time than either of us would like, and a family history that's far from simple. But I have a love for you that is completely, unshakably real, and I would like to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, every single day if you'll let me. Maria Alvarez, will you marry me?" Maria was crying too hard to speak for a long moment, nodding instead again and again, until she finally found her voice. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Daniel slid the ring onto her finger, and as he stood to pull her into his arms, Rosa appeared in the doorway, having clearly been listening from the hallway, tears streaming down her own face, laughing and crying at the same time in the way only mothers seem capable of doing. "Finally," Rosa said, wiping her eyes. "I was starting to think I'd have to arrange this myself." The wedding took place 6 months later, not at some enormous, exclusive venue designed to impress magazine editors, but in the backyard of the Connecticut house, under a simple white arch strung with flowers Rosa had helped choose, surrounded by a guest list that mixed Daniel's business associates with Maria's small circle of family and lifelong friends from Phoenix. People who had never set foot in a house like this before, who Daniel made sure felt welcomed and celebrated, not merely tolerated. Carmen, Maria's mother's neighbor, cried through the entire ceremony. Denise, the staffing agency owner who had once handed Maria a folder with visible confusion about why an overqualified woman would take a housekeeping job, sat in the second row, beaming with the particular pride of someone who had unknowingly played a small role in a much larger story. Rosa walked Maria down the aisle herself, strong enough now, nearly a year after her transplant, to make the short walk without assistance, both women crying before they'd even reached the altar. When Daniel and Maria exchanged vows, neither spoke of billions or business empires or any of the things the world had once assumed defined Daniel Whitfield's life. Instead, Daniel spoke of pantry floors and cold coffee, of humming songs in a language he was still slowly learning, of a woman who taught him that the emptiest houses can become homes, not through square footage or marble floors, but through the people who choose to fill them with genuine love. Maria spoke of a suitcase she'd once packed in fear and shame, convinced her story was ending in that guest bedroom, never imagining it was actually just beginning. She spoke of a mother who sacrificed everything, and a man who gave a literal piece of himself to save her, and a love that had taught her, finally, after years of hiding and shrinking herself to survive, that she deserved to take up space in the world without apology. As the sun set over the Connecticut estate that evening, string lights glowing softly above the dance floor, Daniel and Maria shared their first dance as husband and wife, Rosa watching from the front row with the particular joy of a mother who had spent decades sacrificing everything, finally witnessing her daughter receive, in full, the love she had always deserved. 2 years later, on a quiet Thursday evening not unlike the one that had changed everything, Daniel came home to find Maria in the kitchen, not packing a suitcase this time, but standing at the counter, cutting vegetables for dinner, Rosa's laughter drifting in from the living room where she was reading a bedtime story to a small figure curled beside her on the couch. Their daughter Sophia had been born 8 months earlier, on a spring morning that Daniel still described as the single happiest day of his life, surpassed only by his wedding day, which he insisted with a laugh was really more like a very close tie. Maria had left her housekeeping work behind entirely by then, though not the values it had taught her. Using a portion of the wealth she'd once been so uncomfortable accepting, she and Daniel had established a foundation together. One focused on providing financial assistance and medical support for domestic workers and their families, people like Maria had once been, working impossible hours to care for sick parents or struggling children, often invisible to the very households that depended on their labor. The foundation had already helped over 300 families in its first year alone, a number that grew every month, each case a quiet echo of the story that had once nearly gone untold. Denise, whose staffing agency had placed hundreds of workers into difficult, often thankless positions over the years, now partnered directly with the foundation, ensuring that anyone struggling the way Maria once had would never have to hide their circumstances out of fear or shame ever again. Vanessa, for her part, had eventually moved on, her attempts to publicly damage Daniel's reputation losing steam once the public began to embrace the story of a billionaire who had chosen genuine love over image, a narrative far more compelling than any scandal she tried to manufacture. Maria harbored no bitterness toward her. Not anymore. In an odd way, she sometimes thought, Vanessa's cruelty that rainy Thursday had been the very thing that forced the truth into the open, setting in motion everything that followed. Some doors only open because someone else, however unkindly, forces you through them. That evening after dinner, after Sophia had been tucked into bed, Daniel and Maria sat together on the same back porch where Rosa had once told her daughter that love wasn't about grand gestures, but about who shows up when things are hardest. The Connecticut sky stretched wide and dark above them, scattered with stars neither of them ever tired of watching. "Do you ever think about that night?" Maria asked quietly, resting her head against Daniel's shoulder. "The night you found me packing." "Every single day," Daniel said, wrapping his arm around her. "It's strange, isn't it? The worst night of your life, and the best night of mine, happening in the exact same hour." "I thought my whole world was ending," Maria said softly. "I thought I was losing everything. My job, my dignity, any chance at a future that didn't involve constant fear and hiding. I never imagined I was actually about to gain everything that actually mattered." "Rosa was right," Daniel said. "It's never about the grand gestures. It's about who shows up. You showed up for 2 years in a house that barely noticed you, and I almost let you walk out that door without ever telling you what that meant to me." "But you didn't," Maria said, smiling up at him. "You came home early. And everything changed." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the stars, listening to the quiet hum of a house that had once felt cold and empty, now filled completely with the warmth of a family built not from obligation or convenience, but from genuine, hard-won love. And somewhere inside that house, tucked safely in a closet Maria rarely opened anymore, sat an old, battered suitcase, the same one she'd once packed in fear and heartbreak, believing her story was ending. She kept it not out of sadness, but as a quiet reminder of everything that had changed since that rainy Thursday evening, a symbol of every difficult, uncertain beginning that eventually, against every fear telling her otherwise, led somewhere beautiful. Because sometimes, the story goes, the moment that feels like the absolute end is really just the universe clearing space for something far greater to begin. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, please, take a moment to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. If you're new here, consider subscribing because we bring stories just like this one every single week. Stories about love, resilience, and the quiet moments that end up changing everything. And if you know someone who needs a reminder today that their hardest chapter might actually be leading somewhere beautiful, please, share this story with them. You never know whose life it might touch. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.